Out of 1 Corinthians 4, 1 through 5. So then, men ought to regard us as servants of Christ and as those entrusted with the secret things of God. Now it is required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. I care very little if I am judged by who or by any human court. Indeed, I do not even judge myself. My conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore, judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait till the Lord comes. He will bring to light what is hidden in darkness and will expose the motives of the men's hearts. In that time, each will receive his praise from God. The word of God for the people of God.
So, before I share the scripture tonight, I want to do a little commercial. So, you all hopefully are beginning to think about next semester's classes. Some of you are like all in. You already made your schedule for the next 3 semesters out. If you would want an opportunity to be able to grow in your faith, and particularly to grow in your faith in a classroom environment, I want to encourage you to think about taking CVOC 110. We have this program here at the university. These are not religion courses. You'll take religion courses. Those are required as part of your degree. But rather, these are courses in Christian formation, in discipleship, that you can take for academic credit. If you want to do the whole thing, you can earn a Christian formation concentration. There's all kinds of things that we could talk about there. But the best part of those classes is that we spend an entire semester in CVOC 110 thinking about what it means to be called by God and how we can pursue God's calling on our life. If you don't know what you want to do, we spend some time in there thinking about and exploring and discerning vocation together. If you think you know what you want to do, we're going to put some theological teeth to that. We're going to say, what is it that how has God called us through our work? How has God called us through the things that we're here to do here at the school? So as you're looking at courses, you may just make a little note for yourself. The course designation for that first course is CVOC 110. So you want to start with the 110 class. There'll be other CVOC courses, but they have to be taken in order. Okay, so I would encourage you to sign up for CVOC 110. And that first course is with me, so I think that's motivation enough. Okay, so anyway, sign up for CVOC 110. But tonight I want to start the message by telling you about how I messed up my freshman year. Some of you in here have already had the opportunity to mess up your freshman year, and others of you are in process right now of messing up your freshman year. And so I want to talk about how I messed up mine. So first of all, when I graduated high school, I joined the Marines. Like the day after high school graduation, I got on a bus and went to Marine boot camp. And I was a Marine reservist, so I did about 6 months of training and different things. And I got back, and in January, the year after I graduated high school, I started college. So I started about a semester late, well, exactly 1 semester late, because of the Marines things that I was doing. So I get back, and here's the thing, is that when I was on active duty with the Marines was when I became a Christian. And when I came home from active duty with the Marines is when I got involved with the church for the first time. And when I got involved, I was like all the way in, right? So I was baptized in February of that year. I was going to Bible study and youth group and worship. We did worship 3 times a week. And I was volunteering about 20 hours a week. I mean, I was all in, right? From the very beginning of my faith. And that was the time when I started college. So I was there on scholarship, had a good opportunity for my freshman year. And about midway through my freshman year, my calculus professor says, hey, can you come to my office during office hours? I'll talk to you. He says, okay, sure. And so I went and I talked with a faculty member, and the professor, she says, Jeremiah, you could have the highest grade in the class in calculus, but you haven't done a single homework assignment. You're going to fail. And I said, well, let's see. You know, that didn't motivate me at all to do any more. And in fact, I still never did a single homework assignment the entire calculus class. I got a C minus, which was like credit, but I didn't learn a thing and couldn't continue on in calculus, and I was done then, which, I was fine with that. But I then had another semester, and by the end of that second semester, I had lost my scholarship, because I wasn't doing my work. And then about that time, I transferred to a Bible college because I had now decided I was going to be a pastor and began to pursue pastoral ministry. I transferred to a Bible college, and you might not be surprised to find out I didn't do any better. My second year of school, I think I got about 12 credits out of that entire year of that next year. I wasn't doing well, and whenever I look back on that, I remember that part of what was happening was when I was doing all the church stuff, like when I was showing up for Bible study and I was volunteering and all this, I was getting a lot of accolades, right? So people were super excited for me, and they were excited about what God was doing in my life, and so they're praising me, saying, "Hey, Jeremiah, this is so awesome," and they're encouraging me. And so that was motivating me to pay a lot of attention to my church work and very little attention to my schoolwork. And so I finally, after the second year, I dropped out of college. I didn't go back to college until I was 24. And then when I did go back, I graduated summa cum laude. I got full ride scholarships for my master's, for my PhD. I was a good student. I had the capacity to be able to live into that, but I wasn't living into it. Now, if you talk to psychologists would use a phrase for they would say I was self-sabotaging. You ever heard of that phrase? You are self-sabotaging. Because I had the opportunity in front of me, and either consciously or unconsciously, I was actively deciding not to do the thing that God had called me to do. And because I was immature, I said it was because I was following God, right? Because I was doing all this church stuff, and I'm like, that's the most important thing. The rest of that's not important. And I didn't have enough spiritual maturity or emotional maturity to say, actually, God calls us to multiple things at the same time, right? God was calling me both to be a student and to be a servant at my church, and I didn't have the maturity to be able to parse through that stuff, right? And so I self-sabotaged. And I think, from what I've seen, doing this now for 10 years, I think college students are particularly prone to self-sabotaging. And I think there's a number of reasons why college students will often self-sabotage. I think part of it is because when you were in school, when you were in your parents' home, oftentimes your parents, and not all of you, some of your parents didn't pay much attention, others of you, your parents paid a lot of attention, and they were the ones that made sure you didn't sabotage your life, right? They were the one that made sure you didn't touch the stove, and they were the ones that made sure you didn't, that you paid your bills and that you did your homework, right? Like they were the ones making you say, hey, don't do drugs, right? They were the ones sort of helping you not sabotage your life, and now those decisions are yours. And because sometimes we have to learn to make those decisions, some of us don't make them very well, and so we might be prone to self-sabotage because we're learning that. But the reality is that no matter your age, this kind of self-sabotaging behavior, it actually, it's for all of us. It's not just for college students, it's just that y'all might be a little more prone than somebody who's a little older than you to do that. So what is it? I'm going to talk about just a few kind of different versions of how we self-sabotage, and I think maybe we'll see ourselves in a few of these, and then I'll see what St. Paul might have for guidance for us. So the first self-sabotaging behavior is what I call unintentional decisions. I put the decisions in scare quotes because frequently these aren't decisions at all, right? They're just things that we sort of do. So like I'm supposed to be preaching a sermon right now, but without really thinking very much about it, I make decisions that take me in a direction that doesn't help my cause, right? So maybe it's that I begin to eat that entire bag of chips in the middle of the night and sabotage my health. Or maybe it's I go Netflixing when I'm really supposed to be doing homework, right? Or maybe I don't invest in the relationships that I need to invest in, but instead I take the easy relationships, right? And so all of a sudden I find out like I'm supposed to be over there preaching a sermon, but actually I'm over here doing God knows what for who knows what reason, right? I didn't make a decision to forsake what I was supposed to do. I just sort of ended up doing, right? And I think a lot of us can be prone to that. We'll use phrases like procrastination or something like that, but what we really mean is we're just kind of going with the flow. We're doing the easy thing rather than doing the thing that we really should be doing. That's one version of a self-sabotaging behavior. There's another version of self-sabotage which I think when I've talked with folks, it sounds like this one is really rooted in a fear of failure. And on this one, I'm supposed to be over here doing this, but actually this is a pretty high-risk thing, right? Like you might decide that you like me, or you might decide that you don't like me. And so it's easier for me to do something I really know that I'm good at, like these tables, they really need to be straightened before worship. And so I know that I know how to do table straightening pretty well. And so I will straighten, some of the OCD people are, don't use that phrase like that. And some of the people who are intentionally, like really careful, like that is not neat enough for you, I know. But I do this, or maybe I do laundry, right? Or maybe I clean my room when I'm really supposed to be doing something that's far bigger, far more important, right? And I've seen this one with college students a lot. When you have an opportunity to do something big and you choose the smaller thing instead, right? Somebody says, hey, there's this new research fellowship and you get to partner along with the professor and it's going to be really awesome. But instead of doing that, you're like, oh, but I have my job in the cleaning test tubes in the lab. Like I gotta do my test tube cleaning job because that pays me money, but actually there's this research opportunity that's right before us that we pass up. I've seen it so many times. I can't tell you how many times I have set up a job for a college student. There's somebody calls me and says, hey, I have this job, and I'm like, I have the perfect student for you. And I go and I tell the student, I'm like, this job is going to be awesome. It's a great mentor. It's going to pay well. And the student never applies. And I think a lot of times it's because we get afraid of what it would mean to step out in something big, to take a risk, to take on a big opportunity, and instead we're doing laundry, right? And we instead of doing the project or the paper that somebody may grade us on and tell us that we didn't do it well enough, we'd rather clean our room. So that's another version of self-sabotage. I got another one, and I think this one probably, if it starts to feel like I'm adding you, I really didn't do it on purpose. But some of y'all are perfectionists, and look, this one gets reinforced too. That's the problem. Sometimes we listen to people, right? We care what they think of us. And so whenever we turn in the project that's 100% done, we get praised for that, right? People tell us how awesome we are. But do you know that the project that's 93% done is probably okay? And that the 93% project at the end of the day means that I got to go on and work on something else that's also important, right? And sometimes perfectionism sabotages us because we don't do the things that we really should be doing because we're trying to eke out that last 3%. And some of y'all are still doing it when you know that you could get a 60 and still get an A in the class, right? So here's the thing. That perfectionism, some people are going to reinforce us, but actually it may not be good for us. And in fact, it may be the thing that's making us anxious. It may be the thing that's paralyzing us from being able to do all that God has called us to. Because it's better that I do nothing than I do it 92%. There's another version of self-sabotage. And this one is where we put on masks, right? Like, we don't want to expose the real person, so we put on that mask. And sometimes the mask is like the tough guy. Like, oh yeah, I'm going to show you, and so that kind of tough guy persona, it prevents people from getting very close to us, right? Or sometimes it's like the rebel, You're like, man, I don't care what they think. I'll do whatever I want to do. And really, the I don't care what they think is your way of saying, well, I'm not going to do that thing because that's going to expose me, right? Or sometimes we put on like the effortlessly beautiful thing, right? Like we've done hours to make sure that we look perfect, but it's just kind of cash. We put on these masks because the mask prevents people from seeing what's really going on. And that's one of the reasons that with our community groups this semester, we've said, hey, yeah, you got to show up. You got to be here. You got to be a part of the community, and we need you for that. But what we also need is that you would be real with us, that you would take the mask off, and at least in that place, that you would expose the whole self. Because one of the things that does is it sabotages our relationships, right? It sabotages us from getting truly close with anybody because we've got the mask between us and them. Okay, so there's a lot of ways that we can sabotage ourselves, right? I think that St. Paul provides some guidance. So I'm going to read through this passage in 1 Corinthians. I'm going to talk about the ways that Paul might give us some guidance so that we don't have to sabotage ourselves anymore. Now, first of all, the church at Corinth, they thought they should be in charge of everything. Here's the thing. Big cities always think they should be in charge, right? And Corinth was a big city. And so people who were from Corinth thought that they probably knew more than Paul. They were probably the most critical church of Paul, constantly criticizing the work that he had done among them. And in his first letter to Corinth, Paul is responding to some of his critics who have said that he's not as good of a teacher, not as good as a pastor as Apollos and some of the others who had been among them. Okay? And so he's answering them for the criticism that's being brought to him. And in 1 Corinthians 4, he says this. We had it read, but I'm going to kind of read verse by verse. And if you wouldn't mind putting that back up so we can look at some of these verses. I'm going to start in verse 1. He says, this is how you ought to regard us. How should you think about us? Should you think about us with your criticism? Should you think about us as heroes? Should you think about us as less than? Here's how you should think about it. You ought to regard us as servants of Christ and as those entrusted. So I want to stop there for a second. Servants, by the way, I don't really like when people do the Greek word thing. Like, I do know how to read Greek, but that's not always helpful. But in this case, it actually is helpful. Because there's a word that usually when we hear the word servant in the Bible, in the New Testament in particular, the word is doulos. Okay? Doulos is the same word that is often translated as slave. So when we're called to be slaves to Christ, doulos is the word that we're talking about here. In this case, we're talking about a slightly different word for servant, and it was often a servant who was a hired hand. So here we're talking about a free person, a person with their own integrity, their own sort of decision-making, their own will and power, who becomes an employee and a partner along with. Okay? So he's saying you should think about us as like the servants of Christ. And then the second word, it's not translated well here in the NIV, it says as those entrusted. You might find in your translation of the Bible that it says as stewards. Now that steward, you heard that word before because we use it here in the chapel to talk about the staff who's given responsibility to take something forward. It's not theirs, they don't own it, but they have the responsibility to shepherd it and to care for it. Okay, so they are stewards of worship and community and so on. And so here, he's saying, do you want to know how you ought to think about us? Think about us as servants of Christ and those entrusted, the stewards, with the secret things of God. Okay? So if you want to know who we are, we're the people God trusted with the Word. Okay? So think about us that way. Because that's our role. It's not special, but it's important, and we're trying to be faithful to it. And then he says, verse 2, he says, now, it is required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. It's required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. Now here's the thing. Some of our self-sabotaging behaviors, some of the things I just talked about, are actually rooted in the effects that sin have on us, right? Like they're rooted in the ways that we've been broken, the ways that we've been hurt by sin that's been sinned against us. But there's also another dynamic that in that self-sabotage thing that I talked about before, where we're sabotaging ourselves because we're the sinner, right? And we don't sometimes act faithfully in the way that God has called us to. And so what Paul is saying here is, I've been given the gospel, but anybody that's given something with a trust has to be proven faithful. Now here's the thing. Y'all have been entrusted with something. If you are here tonight, you've been entrusted with the opportunity to pursue this education. You can't take that lightly. I took it lightly. Don't do that. You have been entrusted, some of you, with in your work, you've been entrusted for faithfulness. Right? You've been entrusted to take responsibility for the roles that have been given to you. You have been entrusted with what it means to be faithful within your family. Right? These things that have been entrusted to us, one of the things that we have to avoid, the sabotage, is sabotaging our own faithfulness. Right? And so, there's lots of ways, as we mentioned, that we can do that. Paul's saying, don't let it sabotage your faithfulness. Prove that you are living up to the thing that's been entrusted to you. Okay, he goes on. He says in verse 3, I care very little if I'm judged by you or by any human court. Indeed, I do not even judge myself. Now, listen. When you were an adolescent, you may not know this is not widely talked about, but it would have been helpful if you'd have been taught this when you were 14, by the way. When you are an adolescent, you are hardwired. You are biologically hardwired to care what people think about you. Okay? It's the reason that people can affect us so much when we are 14 years old. Because your brain cares more about what they think about you than it does the right thing to do. Okay? That's the most natural place that we go. Now, we can be taught to overcome that, right? Some of us did learn to overcome what people thought about us and to be able to live into what we should do. But you have learned behaviors when you were an adolescent that you now are carrying into adulthood of caring what the heck somebody thinks about you. And Paul is saying, stop caring what people think about you. Don't even care what you think about you. Stop caring about how you are criticizing yourself. I was talking with somebody today, and I said something about, this person seems to be your biggest critic. And the student said, oh no, that's me. Right? You know, sometimes we have this capacity to tear ourselves down. Paul's saying, you got to stop worrying about what other people think, but you got to stop worrying about what you think of you. The only thing that matters is how God will judge you. How will God judge you? He goes on to say, my conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. My conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. Why would he say that? Because at the end of the day, your confidence in living under the judgment of God alone and not the people around you is not even that you're doing everything right. Right? That whole thing, sometimes people do like well, only God can judge me. Because what they're really saying is like, hey, I got this. You don't have any say over me. But actually, it's not even that you got this. Because when we have the confidence that Paul does, that God is the one who judges us, what he's really saying is, actually, my conscience isn't clear. But my destiny is placed in a God who is gracious and just. My destiny is placed in the hands of a God who is gracious and just. You can trust this God with your destiny. You can trust this God with the judgments that will be pronounced over how you live. Particularly if you try to live into the faithfulness that God has called you to. Right? So here's what Paul's saying. Paul's saying, for me, in my work, Paul's saying in his work, he was entrusted with the good news of the gospel. The most important thing that might be able to be entrusted to a person gets entrusted to him. And he says, I have lived faithfully with this trust that was given to me. And none of y'all can judge me anyway. I can't even judge myself because only God, the gracious and just judge of all, is the one who will make decisions about whether I've acted faithfully. Now here's why I think that's so important. Because many of these self-sabotaging behaviors, so many of the ways that we mess up our own lives, some of them are rooted in just plain immaturity. Right? We're acting like adolescents. We're acting like children when we should be acting like the responsible people that God has made us to be. Do the thing that we're supposed to do. Right? But the other thing is that so many of the ways that we self-sabotage are rooted in our own lack of confidence and worry about what other people are how they're going to judge us. And so we step back from the callings that God has on us and we don't live into the possibilities that are in front of us. We're busy straightening cables when we should be bringing forth the good news of Jesus. Right? So, my encouragement for you tonight is this. In a moment, we're going to have some time of reflection. And I'm going to invite our stewards forward to do that. But I want you to think about what are the ways that you are sabotaging yourself? What are the ways that you are preventing yourself from living into all that God has for you? And how can you bring that under the judgment of Christ alone? For some of you, it means get your butt in gear. For some of you, it means step out because God is the only one who can judge you. And so you need to begin to think through, why is it that I am sabotaging myself? And to begin to live under Christ's lordship and only Christ's lordship. With that, let's pray.